morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a really great show for you today. Lots of new Trump appointments to discuss in detail. Obviously, Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz were announced as potentially joining the administration if they can get Senate approval. We will get into that in just a minute. Hello, Niall.
Hello, Robbie. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
We have a lot to talk about. It's back to a Trump news cycle with just an abundance of news.
How exciting.
Absolutely. A lot of excitement. So let's get started. Robbie, what's on your radar?
Well, in the closing weeks of the 2024 presidential campaign, Vice President Kamala Harris had an opportunity to appear on the Joe Rogan Experience, the most popular podcast in the country. Now, ultimately, we all know how this turned out. She declined that interview. Former President Donald Trump made the most of his 3-hour conversation with Rogan. The video version racked up 38 million views on YouTube in just 3 days. Rogan ultimately endorsed Trump the night before the election. Now, it would be naive to think that Rogan, who has certainly drifted toward the right despite his support for Senator Bernie Sanders in 2019, was ever going to endorse Harris. I don't think that's realistic. And it's probably the case that most of Rogan's viewers, who do skew younger and skew male, would be more positively inclined toward Trump than to Harris. Even so, 40 million people is a lot of viewers. If Harris could have made a positive impression among even some small subset of those Rogan fans, wasn't the interview worth doing? Moreover, the interview would have helped her counter the argument that she is stiff and impersonal, if that is, she did a good enough job. In other words, Harris had much to gain from a successful appearance. It's possible that Harris just wasn't up to the task of making conversation with Rogan for 3 hours. If she declined for that reason, then that was her choice. Indeed, Rogan himself thinks she opted not to do the interview because her team disliked the time commitment and the lack of editing. But a different, much more pernicious explanation was given just yesterday by Jennifer Palmieri, an advisor to Doug Emhoff, the vice president's husband. Now, Palmieri told the Financial Times that Kamala Harris's team ultimately turned down Rogan because of, quote, concerns at how the interview would be perceived within the Democratic Party. Quote, there was a backlash with some of our progressive staff that didn't want her to be on it, said Palmieri. Now, in fairness, that could be a convenient excuse. Maybe Harris didn't feel up to the interview and her team is scapegoating someone else, progressive staffers. But let's say it is true. If so, it's yet another revealing glimpse at how young, progressive staffers are ruining Democratic campaigns and tanking Democratic-aligned institutions in the media, entertainment, education, and elsewhere. As independent journalist Lee Fong observed on X, we live in an age where left liberal leadership destroys itself out of fear of offending lower-level, ultra-privileged woke staffers. Certainly true for the demise of The Intercept and other media. Similarly, journalist Zed Jelani wrote, the news that Kamala Harris ditched Rogan because she was scared of progressive backlash just confirms my thesis that she was not ready for prime time. You can't negotiate with Putin or Kim Jong-un if you can't handle Joe Rogan and a 23-year-old staffer. This once again shows just how out of touch the perpetually aggrieved, terminally woke employees are relative to normal people, the kind of people the Harris campaign desperately wanted to win over. It's also a good reminder of exactly the kind of thing that actually makes progressives mad. Joe Rogan makes them mad because he's not a cultural progressive, even though he would probably define himself, or previously defined himself, as a progressive populist on economic and labor issues. The fact that he aligns with the left, or is at least friendly to the left, on core bread-and-butter Bernie Sanders-style issues, that's irrelevant to progressive Harris staffers because his other opinions, for instance, he probably thinks there are only two genders, for instance, are irredeemably backward for progressives, even though they are widely shared by a majority of ordinary people. Contrast this contempt for Rogan with Harris's embrace of Liz Cheney. No one on the Harris campaign was apparently afraid that Cheney would offend young progressives, and indeed, those people barely made a peep if they were offended. In the real world, plenty of actual progressive people, like the Arab American voters of Michigan, were in fact not terrifically excited about the prospect of Cheney serving in a Harris administration. But the so-called progressives on the campaign, Cheney is A-OK. The Democratic Party tent is big enough for the Cheneys, but it's not big enough for Joe Rogan. That is a problem for Democratic candidates.
That's interesting thoughts all around, Robbie, and quite a few that I actually agree with for a start.
Lovely.
First of all, Liz Cheney, I'd be quite happy to share the dislike or the suspicion that that was a very bad campaign move. I don't think it gained Harris any voters, and I think it lost her a few or deepened the alienation of some. The other point that I do actually agree with you on, and we, I'm sure, have plenty to disagree as the show goes on, but the propensity to not speak to audiences that don't already agree with you, it seems a weird blind spot to me. And it is surely part of the whole project of politics to reach out to people who don't share all of your views or don't perhaps share even the majority of your views to try to win them over. And the point about the arbitrariness of Rogan seemingly being deemed unacceptable by some Democratic staffers and Liz Cheney being deemed acceptable, I think is kind of telling, because it's sort of the sense that Rogan has become this cultural touchstone that divides opinion, and so you just can't go on his show. When, as you pointed out, 38 million views for the Trump interview in the first 3 days just on YouTube alone. That seems a crazy large audience to just ignore or disdain in any way.
Right, and it's just so funny what views are outside. Well, that makes that person a fringe figure who we don't want to associate with. As you said, Liz Cheney was welcomed in, and I get that Democrats should do, Republicans do this all the time, outreach to people who don't agree with them on everything, and that's okay. John Fetterman is out there making the case for Democrats in his state of Pennsylvania, and I think his views on foreign policy are probably alienating to a lot of progressives, but he's trying to bring people in different ways. You have to have enough room for some people, more based, red-leaning Democrats, more progressive Democrats otherwhere, or you're not going to just have a successful coalition. Right. And this is someone with a massive, massive platform who, again, the propensity to go, we can't offend young staffers. And maybe it's an excuse. Maybe that wasn't really what the case was. But we know that young, irate staffers have made life more difficult at a number of otherwise progressive institutions. The venting and complaining, the kind of cancel culture milieu spilling out of that campus mindset that people who don't agree with you entirely are bad people or should be silenced or should be stopped, because it's a form of almost assault on your person to have to consider some opinion you don't entirely agree with. I remember when I was writing about that on college campuses, and I was often told that this isn't a big deal because it will just stay on college campuses, and that when young people have to go get jobs in the real world, that's a losing mentality. It doesn't work. Those people were wrong. That mindset has had some effect on our institutions, on the business world. Now, I think the tide for that level of influence is receding, and if anything, the silver lining of Kamala Harris's loss for Democrats will be maybe a further receding of that. I think a takeaway is going to be that trying to please cultural, woke, young progressives is not a winning strategy. Mm-hmm. Even more so, I think they'll be talking about that, but...
Yeah, I think firstly, the fact is that those attitudes that you're referring to in academia have plainly percolated out. Those people who have joined workforces, who have begun careers and advanced careers sometimes, have brought those attitudes with them. And I think the danger is that you just then ignore a huge swathe of the country, right? And yeah. The whole idea that politics is about addition seems to have gotten lost in all of that mix. And sort of related, a slight tangent, but I now see a lot of progressives suggesting that they should sort of in a lab somewhere manufacture their own Joe Rogan. And I don't really think that's how it works, right? He's been around a long time. He's politically unorthodox, I would say. He does clearly tend toward the right now, but he's not a dogmatic figure in any orthodox sense.
Well, right, and it's not a strictly politics show. He talks about lots of things other than politics. He comes out of UFC participation, commentating. He was the host of Fear Factor. Not every interview he does. And the interview's gone for hours and hours and hours. So they talk about politics and then they talk about other things. Yeah, you're exactly right. That is not a person you create in a lab. Right. Although I think Democrats would benefit from having a Rogan-like commentator type person take an interest in politics rather than only running political figures.
Pod Save America or whatever, exactly. Which is just purely a really basically Democratic propaganda show.
Very much so. All right, lots more to talk about on Rising today. We're going to get into the Tulsi Gabbard, Matt Gaetz, and other nominations Trump made yesterday afternoon. Stay with us.